Happy Thanksgiving, everyone. I am a descendant of Mayflower passenger Richard Warren, who came over in 1620 to Plymouth, and I am proud of that fact. And I thought I would do a video about Thanksgiving and some of the myths that surround it. But first, let me start off by explaining who the Pilgrims were and why they came over. So for the sake of the video, I will call them Pilgrims. They didn't probably call themselves that. They were two groups of people. We had the Separatists and the Englishmen. The Separatists were a group that had broken away from the Anglican Church. And since they weren't allowed to worship any other way but the Anglican Church way in England, they had to leave. So they left and went to the Netherlands. And they were there for probably a little over 10 years. And they didn't really like it there. They felt like their children were becoming too Dutch. And so they were looking for a place that they could go where they could raise their families how they saw fit and worship the way that they wanted. And so the opportunity to go to America came up, and so they took it. Now, the people that financed this journey for them, the merchant adventurers, they needed to secure their investment. So kind of like as an insurance, they had some Englishmen go with them because they needed people who knew how to build or farm or fish, people that could ensure that the colony would not fail. And in exchange, they would send back timber, cod, whatever they could to repay their debt. So that's why we have the Englishmen and the Separatists together. And it looks like our Pilgrims called themselves the Strangers and the Saints. The Saints being the Separatists and the Strangers being the Englishmen. But together they came over on the Mayflower. Now they were supposed to land at the mouth of the Hudson River. But because of the high winds and the bad weather, they got thrown off course and they ended up way north of where they should be. And when they first spotted land, they spotted Cape Cod. So as they were going around the outside arm of Cape Cod, they come to an area, there's rocky shoals and it's very dangerous. So the ship captain, Christopher Jones, decides, no, we're not going to do this. We're going to go back and we're going to anchor at Provincetown. So not that Provincetown was actually a town, but it was a harbor that he knew that he could, in fact, it was called Cape Cod Harbor. But he knew that he could safely put the ship there. So after 66 days at sea, that's what they decided to do. So they landed there and then they did some exploring on Cape Cod, and they eventually found where they were going to put their settlement, and that would be where Plymouth is today, and they called it the New Plymouth. Now, it was really a good location to put a settlement. And the reason being is that there was a settlement there before. It was an Indian village, the Pawtuxet village. The village had been wiped out a few years earlier due to disease that had been brought over from European traders and fishermen and explorers. Now, one of the people that lived in Pawtuxet was a man named Squanto. And Squanto had been kidnapped years earlier and taken over to Europe. And I might as well bring up the fact that before the Pilgrims had gotten there, there had been the traders and explorers, and there were some not good people like Thomas Hunt, who would lure the Indians out to his ship, telling them they were going to trade. And then he actually kidnapped them and took them to Europe and sold them into slavery. Well, Squanto was part of that. And Squanto was actually kidnapped twice. He escaped got back home twice, only to come back and find out that his village had been completely wiped out. So he was somewhat adopted by the Wampanoag tribe. And the Sachem of the Wampanoag is a man named Massasoit. So now that first winter that the Pilgrims settled, 102 came over on the Mayflower, and they all survived, but one of them died on the passage. And that first winter, half of them died. So they were diseased, scurvy, starvation. And plus it was winter and it just wasn't good. They had planned to come earlier, but they got delayed many times in starting and didn't arrive until November. So that first winter was terrible with half of them dying. Now come spring, This whole time, this whole winter, during the winter, you've got these Native Americans are watching them, and they know that. But one of them shows up to them in the springtime, and he says, welcome. And his name was Samoset, and he was sent by Massasoit to kind of feel out these people and see what they were up to and why they were there. Samoset could speak English. Samoset was from a different tribe up north in the area that we now call Maine. And so he was kind of the introduction. But Squanto was their main liaison. Anyway, Squanto was the one that came to them and said, spoke to them. He was the one that Massasoit decided should live with them. He taught them how to plant, how to fish. With planting, he said, you must put the fish head in first, then you plant the corn, and then the bean you plant later around it, and then you plant squash at the bottom. So he was very instrumental in saving their lives. And without the help of Squanto and Massasoit's tribe, I'm quite certain that my ancestors would not have survived. So we do have them to thank for that. So in the autumn of 1621, they had a very good harvest. And because of the harvest, they were celebrating. They were shooting guns and, fixing the fruits of their labor. And according to the Wampanoag tribe, they feel like that Massasoit heard the gunshot and was concerned and wanted to know what was going on. So he shows up with 90 of his people, and they just discovered that they are there celebrating the harvest, which is something that the Native Americans would also do. So since they were there, they were basically invited to enjoy the abundance of the harvest with them. And so they feasted on probably, we know that Massasoit brought 5 deer. And the reason we know certain things are because of William Bradford's book of Plymouth Plantation and another book by Edward Winslow of Mort's Relations. So they do mention some of this stuff in there, and that's how we know about some of the history. And some of it is speculation, like exactly what did they eat for Thanksgiving? We don't really know exactly what they ate, but like the deer, we knew there was 5 deer. And there was a mention of wild turkey in the area. So we assume that they also probably had turkey, geese, duck, fish, of course, and then whatever the vegetables that they had planted. So it was probably quite a feast. The Pilgrims probably were eating at tables, and the Native Americans were probably eating on the ground, as was their custom. They probably did not call it Thanksgiving, but we do know what Edward Winslow had wrote, that they rejoiced together after we had gathered fruits of our labor. So that is kind of indicative of a harvest festival. So Thanksgiving was celebrated regionally well before we actually started celebrating Thanksgiving. Now, how did it come about? So how do we get Thanksgiving? When William Bradford's manuscript of Plymouth Plantation was discovered in the Bishop's Library over in England, which it had been stolen from the Old South Meeting House during the Revolutionary War when the British soldiers were here. They had taken over the Old South, and the manuscript was hidden there. They found it, and most likely, we are assuming this, that they took it back to Europe, and it was there for, up until 1854. So it was rediscovered, and a woman named Sarah Hale had read some of it. So she got her ideas about Thanksgiving from what she had seen Bradford write and what she had seen Edward Winslow write. And she began writing to the presidents at the time and trying to get them to make a Thanksgiving a national holiday. Well, Thanksgiving actually was a proclamation that was made by George Washington after the Revolutionary War. And it was probably more celebrated in the New England area than it was anywhere else. So it wasn't really declared a national holiday at that time. So Sarah Hale writes to 5 presidents, and it wasn't until Abraham Lincoln that she actually got a response and he actually did something about it. So Abraham Lincoln, by 1863, declared that Thanksgiving was going to be a national holiday. Now, you have to remember that the Mayflower ancestors that came over on the Mayflower, the Pilgrims, they were able to establish 50 at least, or maybe a little bit more than 50 years of peace with the Native Americans around them. So I think that is quite an accomplishment. Of course, we all know what happened. More Europeans kept coming and kept taking their land. And as a Native American, you don't have a concept of owning land because nobody can own land. The earth belongs to everybody, and we are to respect the earth, and what we reap from the earth, we are to give back. So the idea of these Europeans coming over and owning their land just wasn't a concept that they could understand. So more Europeans came, encroached on, and pushed out the Indians, and we know that thousands, literally thousands and thousands and thousands of Indians were killed. Of course, Europeans were killed also in Indian wars, but we know that it was invasion of sorts, pushing the Indian nations back further west and further west until eventually we pushed them into territories that were no good for planting or just land that was not good for anything. But now, even today, the Wampanoag tribe is still fighting for rights. They have about 321 acres, I believe it is, that they are fighting for, and they were given rights to their land during the Obama administration, but Trump administration came in and reversed that. And so now they're fighting to get that right for that land back as a reservation. You can see we've got a long ways to go. I recently took a class on Native American studies, and it's pretty horrifying to know all the things that our government has done to the Native American tribes throughout the years, and they seem to be still at it. So the Wampanoag, actually 50 years ago, they declared this Thanksgiving a day of mourning. So they do not celebrate Thanksgiving the way that we do. They look at it as the beginning of the genocide of their people. But like I said, I want to point out that we did have 50 years where the Pilgrims that came in originally had every notion to have peace with the Indians. So it's too bad that we couldn't retain that. Anyway, so that's a little bit about Thanksgiving. I'm still celebrating Thanksgiving, even if there's controversy around it. And I hope you all have a great Thanksgiving. Bye.